The dusty red earth of Ouagadougou stretched endlessly under the burning African sun. In a small compound made of mud bricks and corrugated iron sheets, two young boys sat under the shade of a large baobab tree. Ibrahim Traore was 8 years old with bright, curious eyes that seemed to hold dreams bigger than his small village. Next to him sat his best friend Amadou, a quiet boy with gentle hands who always listened when Ibrahim spoke about changing their country. The two boys had been inseparable since they could walk. Their mothers were sisters who lived in neighboring compounds, and the boys grew up more like brothers than cousins. Every morning they would wake up together, eat millet porridge from the same bowl, and run through the narrow streets of their neighborhood playing games and dreaming impossible dreams. Ibrahim was always the leader between them. Even as a child, he had a way of speaking that made other children stop and listen. He would stand on small rocks and tell stories about great African kings who fought against foreign invaders. His voice would rise with passion as he described how one day Burkina Faso would be truly free from all outside control. Amadou would sit quietly, nodding and encouraging his friend's big ideas. When Ibrahim was 10 years old, he saw something that changed his life forever. French soldiers drove through their village in big military trucks, and behind them came men in expensive suits who spoke to the village chief about mining rights. Ibrahim watched as his own people bowed their heads and agreed to let foreigners take their gold and uranium for almost nothing in return. That night, Ibrahim could not sleep. He climbed onto the roof of his family's house and stared at the stars. Amadou found him there, as he always did when Ibrahim was troubled. "Why do our people always bow down to the white men?" Ibrahim asked his friend. "Why do we let them take everything that belongs to us?" Amadou had no answer, but he sat with Ibrahim until the sun rose. From that day forward, both boys began to understand that their country was not truly independent, even though it had a flag and a president. As they grew older, Ibrahim's fire only burned brighter. He read every book he could find about African history and liberation movements. He learned about Thomas Sankara, the great Burkinabé leader who had tried to free their country from French control decades before. Ibrahim would tell Amadou stories about how Sankara encouraged people to be proud of being African, to grow their own food, and to reject foreign aid that came with chains attached. Amadou became Ibrahim's most loyal supporter and closest advisor. While Ibrahim was the one who spoke with passion to crowds of young people, Amadou was the one who planned and organized. He had a gift for understanding people's motivations and seeing dangers that others missed. The two friends complemented each other perfectly. When they turned 18, both young men made a decision that would change their lives forever. They decided to join the military academy together. Ibrahim wanted to learn how to protect his country from enemies both foreign and domestic. Amadou wanted to study intelligence and security, believing that information was the most powerful weapon of all. The night before they left for military training, the two friends sat under their old baobab tree one last time as children. They made a sacred promise to each other under the African stars. They swore that no matter what happened in their lives, they would always protect each other and work together to free their beloved Burkina Faso from foreign control. Ibrahim placed his hand on Amadou's shoulder and spoke the words that would echo through both their lives. "Brother, we are bound together by more than blood. We are bound by our love for this land and our people. Nothing and no one will ever break the bond between us." Amadou smiled and repeated the same words back to his friend. They sealed their promise with a traditional handshake that their grandfathers had taught them, never imagining that this sacred bond would one day be tested in ways they could never dream. The military academy was harsh and demanding, but Ibrahim thrived like a plant finally receiving water after a long drought. Every morning he woke up before dawn, his body strong and his mind sharper than ever. The other cadets quickly noticed something special about this young man from Ouagadougou. When Ibrahim spoke about duty and patriotism, even the toughest instructors stopped to listen. Amadou excelled in different ways, while Ibrahim commanded attention in the training yard. Amadou quietly mastered the art of gathering information. He could read people like books, understanding their fears and desires with just a glance. His instructors praised his ability to solve complex problems and his talent for seeing patterns that others missed. The two friends continued to support each other, with Ibrahim providing inspiration and Amadou offering careful planning. During their third year at the academy, something happened that changed everything. A group of senior officers visited to give lectures about national security. One French military advisor spoke about how Burkina Faso needed continued partnership with France to maintain stability. He explained that without French support, the country would fall into chaos like other African nations that had tried to go alone. Ibrahim could not stay silent. He stood up in the middle of the lecture hall, his eyes blazing with controlled anger. "With respect, sir," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "How can we call ourselves soldiers if we accept that our own country cannot defend itself? How can we wear this uniform while believing that Africans need foreigners to keep peace in African lands?" The French advisor tried to dismiss Ibrahim's words, but something powerful had been unleashed. Other young cadets began nodding and murmuring agreement. That night, groups of students gathered around Ibrahim as he spoke about true independence and African dignity. Amadou watched with pride as his childhood friend became a natural leader of their generation. Word of Ibrahim's speeches spread throughout the military. Senior Burkinabe officers began taking notice of this passionate young cadet who could inspire others with his vision of a truly independent nation. Some older officers worried about his radical ideas, but many younger soldiers felt hope for the first time in years. When Ibrahim graduated from the academy, he was immediately assigned to an elite unit. His superiors wanted to keep him busy with real military operations, hoping that action would satisfy his revolutionary spirit. Instead, Ibrahim used every mission as an opportunity to connect with soldiers and citizens across the country. Amadou graduated with highest honors in intelligence and strategic planning. He was offered prestigious positions in the capital, but he chose to stay close to Ibrahim. The two friends understood that their destiny was tied together, and that the promises they made under the baobab tree were about to be tested. Over the next 5 years, Ibrahim's reputation grew like wildfire across Burkina Faso. Soldiers loved him because he treated them with respect and shared their hardships. Civilians admired him because he spoke their language and understood their struggles. Most importantly, he never forgot where he came from or the dreams that first inspired him as a child. Ibrahim organized secret meetings with like-minded officers who shared his vision of ending foreign control over their country. Amadou helped plan these gatherings, using his intelligence skills to ensure they remained hidden from government spies. Together, they built a network of patriots who were ready to take action when the time was right. The breaking point came when the government signed a new agreement giving French companies even more control over Burkina Faso's gold mines. The president announced that this partnership would bring prosperity, but Ibrahim and his followers knew it meant continued exploitation of their people's resources. That night, Ibrahim called a final meeting of his most trusted supporters. Standing before them in a small room lit by oil lamps, he spoke words that would change their nation forever. "Brothers, the time for talking is over. Tomorrow we take back our country. Tomorrow we show the world that Africans can govern themselves with dignity and strength." Amadou stood beside him, ready to help his childhood friend fulfill the dreams they had shared since they were boys sitting under the baobab tree. Neither of them could imagine that within a few short years, their unbreakable bond would face the ultimate test. In the elegant marble halls of French intelligence headquarters in Paris, alarm bells were not just ringing, they were screaming. Director Philippe Moreau sat behind his massive oak desk, reading reports about the situation in Burkina Faso with growing concern. The papers scattered before him painted a troubling picture of a young African leader who refused to play by the old colonial rules. Ibrahim Traore had successfully taken power just 6 months ago, and already his impact was being felt far beyond the borders of his small West African nation. The French intelligence services had folders thick with reports about Ibrahim's activities, and every single page worried them more than the last. The first concern was economic. French companies had controlled Burkina Faso's gold and uranium mines for decades, paying minimal royalties while extracting billions of dollars worth of resources. Under previous presidents, these arrangements had been quietly renewed year after year. But Ibrahim had immediately announced that all mining contracts would be reviewed and renegotiated to benefit the Burkinabe people first. Even worse from France's perspective, Ibrahim was not keeping his revolutionary ideas to himself. Intelligence reports showed that he was actively reaching out to leaders in Mali, Niger, Chad, and other former French colonies. He was encouraging them to examine their own relationships with France and consider following Burkina Faso's example of true independence. Director Moreau called an emergency meeting with his top operatives. The conference room filled with men and women who had spent decades managing French interests across Africa. These were people who understood how to maintain control through a careful mixture of economic incentives, political pressure, and, when necessary, more direct intervention. "The woman who runs our Burkina Faso operations is concerned," reported Agent Sarah Dubois, a specialist in West African affairs. "Ibrahim Traore is not like the leaders we have dealt with before. He cannot be bought with money or threatened with economic sanctions. His support among the people is too strong, and his military is completely loyal to him. What makes him even more dangerous," added another operative, "is that he understands exactly how our system works. He has studied every method we use to maintain influence, and he is systematically dismantling each one. He is teaching other African leaders to recognize and resist our standard approaches." Director Moreau studied a large map of Africa hanging on the conference room wall. Red pins marked countries where French influence was strong, while yellow pins showed nations where that influence was being challenged. In just 6 months, the number of yellow pins had doubled, and most of the change could be traced back to Ibrahim's influence. The situation was even more urgent because of timing. French president had just announced a major initiative to strengthen economic ties with African nations. If Ibrahim's anti-French movement continued to spread, it could undermine billions of euros in planned investments and trade agreements. The French government was already facing pressure from mining companies and other corporations who were watching their African profits disappear. "We need someone on the inside," Director Moreau announced to his team. "Someone who has access to Ibrahim's inner circle. Someone who can provide us with real-time intelligence about his plans and possibly influence his decisions." The intelligence team had already been studying Ibrahim's closest advisors and supporters. They had detailed files on everyone from his bodyguards to his cabinet ministers. But one name kept appearing at the top of every analysis: Amadou Diallo, Ibrahim's childhood friend and head of internal security. Agent Dubois opened Amadou's file and spread photographs and documents across the conference table. "Here is our best option," she explained. "Amadou has unlimited access to Ibrahim. They have been best friends since childhood, and Ibrahim trusts him completely. More importantly, our psychological profile suggests he might be vulnerable to the right approach." The file revealed that Amadou had 3 young children and a wife who suffered from a chronic illness requiring expensive medical treatment. His government salary was modest, and intelligence suggested he sometimes worried about providing for his family's future. Unlike Ibrahim, who seemed driven purely by ideology, Amadou appeared to have more practical concerns. Agent Dubois continued her presentation. "We believe Amadou genuinely loves his country, but he may be more realistic about the challenges of opposing French interests. If we approach this correctly, we might be able to convince him that he would be protecting both his friend and his nation by providing us with information." Director Moreau nodded slowly as he absorbed the implications. This would be a delicate operation requiring patience and skill. They could not simply offer Amadou money like they might with a typical corrupt official. Instead, they would need to make him believe that helping France was actually the best way to help Burkina Faso. The plan that emerged from that meeting would unfold over many months. It would require finding the perfect operative to approach Amadou, someone who could gain his trust and gradually influence his thinking. someone who could make betraying his best friend seem like an act of loyalty rather than treachery. The grand ballroom of the Continental Hotel in Ouagadougou sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the soft glow of expensive candles. It was the annual diplomatic reception, where ambassadors and government officials gathered to discuss trade and cooperation between nations. Amadou stood near the refreshment table, wearing his best military dress uniform, watching the crowd of international guests with careful eyes. As head of internal security, Amadou attended these events not for pleasure but for protection. His job was to observe everyone who came near President Ibrahim, identifying potential threats and ensuring his childhood friend's safety. He had learned to read faces and body language, spotting danger in a crowded room full of smiling diplomats. That evening, a woman approached him with a warm smile and confident steps. She was tall and elegant, with short brown hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to notice everything. Her dress was simple but expensive, and she carried herself with the grace of someone accustomed to important social gatherings. "Excuse me," she said in perfect French, but with a slight accent that suggested she had lived in many different countries. "You must be Amadou Diallo. I have heard so much about your work in keeping Burkina Faso secure." Amadou was immediately alert. Strangers who knew his name and his position were always potential risks. But this woman seemed different from the typical intelligence operatives he had learned to recognize. She extended her hand with genuine warmth. "I am Marie Bonneau," she continued. "I work with several European development organizations that are very interested in supporting African-led initiatives. Your president's vision for true independence is quite inspiring, even if some people find it challenging." Mary spoke about development projects in ways that impressed Amadou. Unlike many foreign aid workers who talked down to Africans or assumed they needed saving, Mary spoke about partnership and respect for local knowledge. She seemed genuinely interested in hearing Amadou's thoughts about what Burkina Faso really needed to prosper. Over the next hour, they discussed everything from education programs to agricultural development. Marie listened carefully to Amadou's ideas and asked thoughtful questions about his experiences growing up in rural Burkina Faso. She never once mentioned politics or tried to pump him for sensitive information. As the evening ended, Marie gave Amadou her business card. "I hope we can continue this conversation sometime," she said. "It is rare to meet someone who understands both security concerns and development needs so well. Perhaps we could have coffee next week to discuss some ideas I have for youth education programs." Amadou found himself looking forward to their next meeting. Marie was intelligent and well-traveled, but she also seemed to genuinely care about African development rather than just extracting resources or pushing foreign agendas. When they met for coffee 3 days later, she brought detailed proposals for scholarship programs that would allow Burkinabe students to study in Europe while maintaining strong connections to home. These scholarships would be different from typical programs, Marie explained. Students would be required to return home after their studies and commit to working in Burkina Faso for at least 5 years. The goal is to build local expertise, not brain drain. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond development work. Marie shared stories about her travels across Africa and her frustration with how European governments and corporations often treated African nations. She spoke passionately about the need for more respectful partnerships based on equality rather than exploitation. However, Marie also began expressing subtle concerns about some of Ibrahim's more confrontational policies. She worried that completely cutting ties with former colonial powers might hurt ordinary citizens who depended on trade and investment. She suggested that perhaps there were ways to achieve independence while maintaining beneficial relationships. "Your president's heart is in the right place," Marie said during one of their coffee meetings. "But sometimes idealism needs to be balanced with pragmatism. The goal should be improving people's lives, not just making political statements." These words planted seeds of doubt in Amadou's mind. He had always been the practical one in his friendship with Ibrahim, the person who worried about details and consequences, while Ibrahim focused on big dreams and bold actions. Marie's concerns echoed some of his own private worries about whether Ibrahim's revolutionary approach might sometimes do more harm than good. Marie was patient and never pushed too hard. She allowed their friendship to develop naturally, always presenting herself as someone who wanted to help Africa succeed. She offered Amadou opportunities to attend conferences in Europe where he could meet other African leaders and development experts. She suggested that his children might benefit from international educational exchanges. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marie was creating a web of obligations and opportunities around Amadou. Each gift and offer came with no strings attached, but together they began to make him feel indebted to her generosity and dependent on her continued friendship. Most importantly, Marie was teaching Amadou to see Ibrahim's policies through different eyes, to question whether absolute confrontation with former colonial powers was really the best path forward for their beloved country. 6 months had passed since Amadou first met Marie at the diplomatic reception. What began as casual conversations about development projects had slowly transformed into something much deeper and more dangerous. Amadou found himself looking forward to their weekly meetings more than he cared to admit, and Marie had become someone he trusted with thoughts he shared with no one else. The change happened so gradually that Amadou barely noticed it at first. Marie would ask innocent questions about Ibrahim's schedule or mention concerns about upcoming government policies. She never demanded information directly, but somehow Amadou found himself sharing details about cabinet meetings and security arrangements just to ease her worries about the country's direction. It started with small things. When Marie expressed concern about a planned demonstration against French mining companies, Amadou mentioned that Ibrahim would be speaking at the rally from the main platform in Liberation Square. He told himself he was just helping a friend understand the political situation better. When Marie worried that Ibrahim's criticism of foreign aid might hurt development projects that helped poor families, Amadou shared details about which international organizations were being asked to leave the country. He convinced himself that Marie needed this information to protect the programs that actually helped people. Marie was always grateful for these insights, praising Amadou's wisdom and balanced perspective. "You understand both security needs and humanitarian concerns so well," she would tell him. "If only more leaders had your practical approach to these complex issues." The flattery worked because it appealed to something deep inside Amadou. Throughout their friendship, Ibrahim had always been the visionary, while Amadou handled practical details. Sometimes Amadou wondered if his childhood friend appreciated how much careful planning went into making revolutionary dreams become reality. Marie began offering more substantial opportunities. She arranged for Amadou's oldest daughter to receive a full scholarship to study medicine in France. She connected his wife with specialists in Paris who could provide advanced treatment for her chronic condition at no cost. She offered Amadou himself consulting opportunities with European security firms that could supplement his government salary. These were not bribes, Marie insisted. They were investments in good people who wanted to serve Africa effectively. But each gift created another thread connecting Amadou to French interests, making it harder for him to refuse when Marie's requests became more specific. The first real intelligence breakthrough came when Marie expressed worry about reports that Ibrahim was planning to nationalize all foreign mining operations. Such a dramatic step could destabilize the entire regional economy, she explained. If we knew the timeline and details, perhaps cooler heads could find a compromise that achieves Ibrahim's goals without causing economic chaos. Amadou found himself providing copies of confidential government documents outlining the nationalization plan. He told himself that sharing this information might actually help Ibrahim by allowing international partners to prepare constructive alternatives rather than simply opposing the policy. Marie's French intelligence handlers were thrilled with the quality of information they were receiving. Amadou had access to everything: Ibrahim's complete schedule, security protocols, military planning documents, and private conversations with other African leaders. Most importantly, Amadou seemed to genuinely believe he was helping his country by providing this intelligence. The information allowed French operatives to stay several steps ahead of Ibrahim's initiatives. When Ibrahim planned surprise visits to other African capitals, to build anti-French coalitions. French diplomats were already there waiting with counter-proposals when Ibrahim prepared to announce new economic partnerships with China and Russia. French companies mysteriously offered better deals at the last minute. Ibrahim began to notice that his opponents seemed unusually well-informed about his strategies. Private conversations somehow became public knowledge. Confidential negotiations were undermined by leaks that benefited French interests. But Ibrahim trusted his inner circle completely, especially Amadou, so he never suspected that the leak was coming from within his own security apparatus. Amadou felt increasingly conflicted about his double life. Part of him knew that sharing government secrets was wrong, but he had convinced himself that he was actually protecting Ibrahim from his own extremism. Marie had taught him to see Ibrahim's anti-French policies as dangerous idealism that could hurt their people and isolate their country. The betrayal was now complete, even though Amadou refused to admit it to himself. Colonel Moussa Ouedraogo had served in intelligence for 15 years, and his instincts told him something was terribly wrong. As one of Ibrahim's most trusted security advisors, he had noticed disturbing patterns in how their most sensitive operations were being compromised. Enemy forces knew too much about troop movements. Confidential negotiations leaked to foreign press at precisely the wrong moments, and somehow French diplomats always seemed prepared for Ibrahim's most surprising policy announcements. Moussa began conducting his own quiet investigation without telling anyone, not even Ibrahim. He started by analyzing which operations had been compromised and who had access to information about each one. The pattern that emerged made his blood run cold. Every single leaked operation had one thing in common: Amadou had been briefed about it beforehand. Still, Moussa could not believe that Ibrahim's childhood friend would betray him. Amadou had been like a brother to Ibrahim since they were children. He had stood beside Ibrahim through every challenge, from military academy to the coup that brought them to power. There had to be another explanation. Moussa decided to set a trap. He created false information about a planned military operation and shared it only with Amadou, telling him that Ibrahim wanted complete secrecy about the mission. Then Moussa waited to see if the false information would somehow reach foreign intelligence services. Within 48 hours, French military attaches were asking detailed questions about the exact false operation that Moussa had described to Amadou. The evidence was undeniable, but Moussa still needed to understand how deep the betrayal went. Using advanced surveillance equipment, Moussa began monitoring Amadou's communications and movements. What he discovered shocked him even more than the betrayal itself. Amadou was in regular contact with a French operative named Marie Bonneau, sharing detailed intelligence through encrypted messaging apps and dead-drop locations around the capital. The depth of the intelligence sharing was staggering. Amadou had provided the French with Ibrahim's complete security protocols, travel schedules, private meeting transcripts, and strategic planning documents. He had essentially given foreign intelligence services a complete roadmap to understanding and countering every move Ibrahim made. Moussa spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing all the evidence before he finally accepted the horrible truth. Ibrahim's most trusted friend, the man who controlled their entire internal security apparatus, was working for French intelligence. The betrayal was not just personal, it was a complete compromise of national security. The confrontation happened on a rainy Thursday morning in Moussa's office. He called Amadou for what appeared to be a routine security briefing, then locked the door and activated electronic countermeasures to prevent any surveillance. "We need to talk about your relationship with Marie Bonneau," Moussa said quietly, placing photographs of Amadou's meetings with the French operative on his desk. Amadou's face went completely pale. His hands began to shake as he stared at the evidence of his secret activities spread before him. For several minutes he said nothing, just staring at the photographs, as if hoping they would disappear. "How long have you known?" Amadou finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Long enough to understand the full scope of what you have done," Moussa replied. "What I do not understand is why. Why would you betray the brother who trusted you with everything?" The story poured out of Amadou like water from a broken dam. He told Musa about Marie's initial approach, about the gradual development of their relationship, about the opportunity she had provided for his family. Most importantly, he explained how Marie had convinced him that sharing information with French intelligence was actually protecting Ibrahim and Burkina Faso from dangerous policies. "I thought I was saving him from himself," Amadou said through tears. "Marie helped me understand that Ibrahim's confrontational approach was hurting our people. I believe that by providing information, I could help find peaceful solutions that would achieve our goals without unnecessary conflict." Musa listened to Amadou's confession with growing anger and sadness. He understood how skilled operatives could manipulate someone's love for their country and their friend, but he also knew that Amadou's betrayal had put Ibrahim's life in danger and compromised their nation's security. The hardest part was yet to come. Musa had to decide whether to handle this quietly or involve Ibrahim directly. He knew that learning about Amadou's betrayal would devastate Ibrahim emotionally, but he also knew that Ibrahim had the right to know that his closest friend had been working for their enemies. That evening, Musa requested a private meeting with Ibrahim. They met in Ibrahim's personal study, away from all recording devices and potential surveillance. Musa had prepared himself for this conversation, but nothing could have prepared him for the look of complete shock and heartbreak that crossed Ibrahim's face when he learned the truth. Ibrahim sat in silence for almost 10 minutes after Musa finished explaining the situation. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with pain rather than anger. "Bring him to me tomorrow morning," Ibrahim said. "We will handle this together, as everything should have been handled from the beginning." Neither man slept that night, knowing that the next day would change everything forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across Liberation Square as thousands of people gathered for what they believed would be a routine presidential address. Ibrahim had called for a special assembly, announcing only that he needed to speak to the nation about matters of security and trust. Citizens filled the square from edge to edge, many carrying small flags and wearing shirts with Ibrahim's image. Ibrahim's cabinet members and security advisors expected him to announce the arrest and execution of the traitor who had been discovered within their inner circle. This was how such betrayals were typically handled in military governments. Quick justice would send a clear message to other potential spies and restore confidence in their security apparatus. But Ibrahim had spent the entire night in prayer and reflection, thinking about the promises he and Amadou had made under the baobab tree as children. He remembered their shared dreams of an Africa that would be different from the violent, revenge-driven continent that colonial powers had created. He thought about what kind of leader he wanted to be and what kind of example he wanted to set for other African nations. As Ibrahim walked onto the platform, flanked by his security detail, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. But their enthusiasm turned to confusion when they saw Amadou walking behind the president, not in chains or under heavy guard, but walking freely with tears streaming down his face. Ibrahim approached the microphone and raised his hand for silence. The massive crowd gradually quieted until the only sounds were birds singing in nearby trees and the distant hum of traffic beyond the square. "My people," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying clearly across the square through loudspeakers. "Today I must speak to you about something that has broken my heart, but which has also taught me important lessons about our struggle for true independence." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces before him. Many people in the crowd had known both Ibrahim and Amadou since they were children. They understood that these two men were closer than brothers, bound together by shared dreams and mutual trust. "Someone very close to me has made serious mistakes," Ibrahim continued. "Someone I trusted with my life has been sharing our government's secrets with foreign intelligence services. This person believed he was protecting our country, but his actions put our security at risk and helped our enemies work against us." Murmurs of anger began rising from the crowd. People started shouting demands for justice and punishment, but Ibrahim raised his hand again, and his voice grew stronger. "This person is my childhood friend, Amadou Diallo," Ibrahim announced. The crowd gasped in shock, and many people began shouting for Amadou's immediate arrest. Instead of responding to the crowd's anger, Ibrahim walked over to where Amadou stood trembling with fear and shame. In front of thousands of witnesses, Ibrahim placed his hands on Amadou's shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "Brother," Ibrahim said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you have made terrible mistakes, but I know your heart. I know that you love this country and our people. I also know that our enemies are skilled at turning good people against each other by offering false hope and manipulating their fears." The crowd fell completely silent, straining to hear every word of this unprecedented conversation between the betrayer and the betrayed. Ibrahim turned back to address the people directly. "This is exactly how colonial powers have always controlled Africa," he explained. "They turn us against each other. They find our weaknesses and use them to divide us. They convince some of us that working with them is the only way to protect our families and our futures." He gestured toward Amadou, who was now openly weeping. "But today we break that cycle. Today we show that African leadership means something different. We show that we can be strong enough to forgive, wise enough to learn from betrayal, and united enough to turn our enemies into our allies." Ibrahim embraced Amadou in front of the entire crowd, and the square erupted in a mixture of cheers, gasps, and confused shouting. Never in the history of African politics had anyone seen a leader respond to such betrayal with public forgiveness rather than swift punishment. "Amadou," Ibrahim said, speaking directly to his friend, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "I offer you a choice. You can leave this country forever and never return, taking with you the knowledge of how foreign intelligence services operate, or you can stay here and help us expose every spy network, every manipulation tactic, and every corrupt relationship that foreign powers use to control African nations." Amadou fell to his knees in front of Ibrahim and the entire crowd. "I choose to stay," he said through his tears. "I choose to spend the rest of my life undoing the damage I have caused and protecting the dreams we shared as children." The crowd was completely stunned by what they had witnessed. Social media immediately exploded with videos and commentary about Ibrahim's unprecedented response to betrayal. News outlets across Africa and around the world struggled to understand and explain what had just happened in Liberation Square. But Ibrahim understood exactly what he was doing. He was showing Africa and the world a new model of leadership, one based on strength through forgiveness rather than strength through revenge. Within hours of Ibrahim's shocking public forgiveness of Amadou, videos of the Liberation Square speech were spreading across Africa faster than wildfire in dry season. Social media platforms crashed from the volume of shares, comments, and discussions about what people were calling the most extraordinary display of leadership in modern African history. In Lagos, Nigeria, students gathered around their phones in university courtyards, watching the footage again and again. They debated whether Ibrahim was being wise or foolish, strong or weak. But even those who questioned his decision could not deny that they had never seen anything like it before. In Accra, Ghana, market women paused their daily trading to watch the video on a shop owner's tablet. They discussed how differently African leaders usually handled betrayal, remembering countless examples of executions, imprisonments, and revenge that had torn their continent apart for decades. In Nairobi, Kenya, opposition politicians found themselves speechless as they watched Ibrahim embrace the man who had betrayed him. They understood the political calculations that typically drove such decisions, but Ibrahim seemed to be operating by completely different rules. The reaction was not uniformly positive. Many people across Africa criticized Ibrahim's decision as naive and dangerous. "How can you trust someone who has already betrayed you once?" they asked. "What message does this send to other potential traitors?" Some military leaders worried that showing mercy to spies would encourage more betrayals. But something deeper was happening across the continent. Ibrahim's actions had forced millions of Africans to think about fundamental questions of leadership, forgiveness, and what it meant to break free from colonial patterns of governance. His response challenged assumptions about power and revenge that had shaped African politics since independence. The most significant reactions came from other African heads of state. In private conversations that intelligence services across the continent carefully monitored, presidents and prime ministers discussed the implications of Ibrahim's approach. Some dismissed it as political theater, but others began reconsidering their own methods of dealing with internal conflicts. President Akufo-Addo of Ghana called Ibrahim personally to discuss the situation. "We have all faced betrayals from people we trusted," he said during their private conversation. "But none of us have had the courage to respond the way you did. You have given us all something to think about." Similar calls came from leaders across West Africa and beyond. Some offered support, others asked for advice, and a few sought to understand whether Ibrahim's approach could work in their own political situations. Meanwhile, Amadou began the difficult work of redemption. True to his promise in Liberation Square, he started providing detailed information about French intelligence operations across West Africa. His insider knowledge of how European spy networks operated proved invaluable in helping other African nations identify and counter similar infiltration attempts. Amadou's first major contribution was exposing a network of French operatives working in Mali, Niger, and Chad. He provided names, methods, communication channels, and operational details that these countries' security services had been trying to uncover for years. Within weeks, several spy rings were rolled up across the region. The intelligence sharing went both ways. As Amadou helped expose French operations, other African intelligence services began sharing information about similar networks in their own countries. For the first time, African nations were coordinating counterintelligence efforts on a continental scale. French intelligence services found their carefully constructed influence networks crumbling faster than they could rebuild them. Operations that had taken years to establish were being exposed and dismantled within weeks. Amadou's defection had not just compromised French activities in Burkina Faso, it had triggered a continental awakening to the scope of European intelligence infiltration. Director Philippe Moreau in Paris found himself facing the worst intelligence disaster in decades. The Murray-Bono operation had not only failed to neutralize Ibrahim Traore, it had created a counterintelligence expert who understood French methods from the inside and was now actively working against them. But the most profound impact was cultural and political rather than operational. Ibrahim's handling of the betrayal had created a new narrative about African leadership. Young people across the continent began discussing the possibility of leaders who were strong enough to show mercy, confident enough to forgive enemies, and wise enough to transform betrayal into unity. University students organized debates about leadership models, comparing Ibrahim's approach to traditional African concepts of justice and reconciliation. Religious leaders praised his example of forgiveness while maintaining strength. Artists and musicians began creating works inspired by the story of two childhood friends whose bond had survived even the ultimate betrayal. The story resonated particularly strongly in countries that had experienced civil wars, coups, and ethnic conflicts. People began wondering whether their own leaders could find ways to heal divisions through forgiveness rather than perpetuating cycles of revenge. Social media hashtags like African Unity and Forgiveness is Strength spread across the continent, with millions of people sharing their thoughts about what Ibrahim's example meant for Africa's future. The conversation had moved far beyond politics and security to fundamental questions about what kind of continent Africans wanted to build for their children. Ibrahim watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. His decision to forgive Amadou had not been calculated for political effect, but he understood that it was creating exactly the kind of change he had dreamed about since childhood, a new way of thinking about African leadership that could inspire lasting transformation across the continent. 2 years after that historic day in Liberation Square, the map of Africa had fundamentally changed, not through wars or invasions, but through a quiet revolution inspired by the story of two childhood friends whose bond had proven stronger than foreign manipulation. The transformation began in Mali, where President Goïta watched Ibrahim's example and decided to handle his own internal conflicts differently. Instead of executing military officers suspected of plotting against him, Goïta offered them opportunities to explain their grievances and join efforts to strengthen the country. The policy of reconciliation rather than revenge began producing remarkable results, with former enemies becoming some of his most loyal supporters. In Niger, President Bazoum faced similar challenges with opposition groups funded by foreign interests. Following Ibrahim's model, he publicly exposed the foreign manipulation while offering amnesty to those who had been deceived. The transparent approach won public support and undermined the credibility of external interference. The changes spread beyond West Africa. In Chad, President Deby began implementing policies that prioritized African unity over relationships with former colonial powers. In the Central African Republic, leaders started using mediation and forgiveness to address ethnic conflicts that had plagued the country for decades. Most significantly, these individual transformations began creating continental momentum. The African Union, previously criticized as ineffective, found new energy as member nations embraced cooperation over competition. Regular summits focused on sharing strategies for resisting foreign manipulation and building genuine independence. Amadou became a central figure in this continental awakening. His detailed knowledge of how European intelligence services operated across Africa proved invaluable in helping multiple countries identify and counter foreign infiltration. He traveled throughout the continent, teaching security services how to recognize recruitment attempts and protect their leaders from manipulation. More importantly, Amadou's story became a powerful symbol of redemption and second chances. Across Africa, former enemies began sitting down for dialogue rather than continuing cycles of violence. The concept that betrayal could be transformed into loyalty through forgiveness rather than punishment inspired countless reconciliation efforts. The economic implications were equally dramatic. As African nations began coordinating their resistance to exploitative relationships with former colonial powers, they gained leverage in negotiating fairer deals for their natural resources. Gold, uranium, oil, and diamonds that had been extracted for decades at minimal benefit to African peoples began generating real wealth for local communities. Ibrahim and Amadou worked together to establish the African Intelligence Cooperation Network, sharing counterintelligence expertise and coordinating responses to foreign interference. The network grew to include over 30 countries within its first year, creating the most effective continental security cooperation in African history. French influence across Africa contracted dramatically as one country after another followed Burkina Faso's example. Military bases were closed, mining contracts were renegotiated, and development aid relationships were restructured to prioritize African agency rather than European control. The French government initially responded with economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure, but these traditional tools proved ineffective against a coordinated continental response. When France attempted to isolate Burkina Faso economically, other African nations stepped in to provide alternative trade relationships and mutual support. China and Russia offered to fill the gap left by reduced European influence, but Ibrahim and his continental allies were careful to avoid simply replacing one form of dependence with another. The new relationships were structured as genuine partnerships between equals rather than patron-client arrangements. The most profound change was cultural and psychological. A generation of young Africans grew up seeing their continent as capable of solving its own problems and determining its own future. Universities across Africa began teaching courses about the Traore Amadou model of transforming conflict through forgiveness and unity. Ibrahim often reflected on how dramatically his childhood promise to Amadou had shaped continental history. Their bond, tested by the ultimate betrayal and strengthened through forgiveness, had become a template for African relationships at every level, from personal friendships to international diplomacy. The baobab tree where they had made their childhood promises still stood in Ouagadougou, now surrounded by a small park where children played and students studied. A simple plaque at its base read in French, English, and local languages, "The strongest bonds are those that survive the greatest tests." On quiet evenings, Ibrahim and Amadou would sometimes return to sit under their old tree, watching the sun set over a continent that was finally beginning to fulfill the dreams they had shared as children. The betrayal that was meant to destroy their friendship and their revolution had instead become the catalyst for the most significant transformation in modern African history. Their story proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying enemies, but from the wisdom and courage to transform them into allies. In choosing forgiveness over revenge, unity over division, and hope over fear, they had shown Africa and the world a different path forward, one that honored both strength and compassion, justice and mercy. The revolution was far from complete, but its foundation was unshakable because it was built on something more powerful than military force or economic pressure. It was built on the simple but profound truth that even the deepest betrayals could be overcome through the transformative power of forgiveness and the unbreakable bonds of genuine friendship.